Mudrzynski. Brad is new at the office. He's been there since January. And so this is a real experiment for him, and I think he's having a pretty good time. He'll tell us all about it. As an Elva dairy farm kid who had a keen interest in eco-sciences, he studied the wetlands and eco-restoration, soil and geology. And Brad is a scientist who taught at geology at Brockport State and before he came to Batavia for this new job. He's especially interested in geology and here tonight to talk to us about prime farmland and geology, plants, ecosystems. The information here is some of our our most precious resources. Let's all welcome Brad.
So if I did this correctly, this should be showing up on the screen.
And would you like your lights?
There we go. Look, you tell me.
Yeah.
If you guys could read that now, we'll take the lights down. It's a little too dark. I'll take a
Is
nap.
that okay for the camera? Yep.
We don't have to have the camera, it's okay, really.
Really,
I'm going
it's
to
not
be dancing as
really
much as I
used
can
against
so the
you,
camera
Brad.
can follow me.
Is that too
Put it back where it
little?
was.
You like it?
One notch back.
Fine on you where we do. So I threw this presentation together. Thank you for the introduction. So I grew up Alva, New York, so just a little northwest from here. It's funny, I actually went to college at SUNY Brockport and actually stayed there. I worked there for a little while. My degree is in environmental science and biology. As she alluded to, a lot of my background is in wetland ecology, restoration ecology, that kind of stuff, which when you're working with full ecosystems, you have to know a little bit about everything, which is really tough. And that includes not just the plants, not just the animals, but also the soils that the plants grow in, which then depict what kind of plants can grow. So what I put together from here was some of my knowledge based on that work. I did teach for a little bit at SUNY Brockport. It was a side job, essentially. I was an adjunct professor, which is like being a backup quarterback on a football team to give you the playbook till you don't screw up. And there was a couple lectures in there, geology and soils. So I pulled from there. So without further ado, I think I actually went through the first two slides here. Yes, so SUNY Brockport, worked at Brockport. I was in consulting for a little bit. Now I just started in Soil and Water Conservation District. Soil and water has been in existence since the 1940s. Real brief, we work collaboratively with landowners, private landowners, to reduce their impact on the land. Whether that is working with farms to reduce erosion, which that erosion takes soil and nutrients into the water. We also do a lot of work in streams recently. We've been doing a lot of water quality monitoring, find where maybe some of the hot spots are for some of the issues. We've been recently getting involved in some invasive species work for habitat restoration purposes. So we work with the landowners in a collaborative sense. We're allowed to work on private property, which is fairly unique for many the government agencies. So my goal here is to kind of give an overview, scientific context of how Genesee County got our soil specifically. So there's an overarching theme, and I'll tie it back to specifically what's going on in Genesee County. So the how, where, why different soils form in the areas, and the impact that those different soils have on the ecosystems, on gardens, on farms, all of that stuff. So the first question is, well, how does soil come to exist? There is a good classic model in scientific literature. It was funny, it was developed by a soil scientist, but I learned about it because it gets applied to habitats and ecosystems as well, as the same model. So this model, it is the things that make soil, so climate, organisms, relief, parent material, and time, which is a wonderful acronym, CLORT, because that's a real word. CLORT, so climate, organisms, relief, parent material, and time. And I'll go through these as to what they all mean and what they do. So I'm actually going to start out of order, because CLORT is CL, and when I start with climate, I actually prefer starting with the parent material. So when we say parent material, we are talking the bedrock, the rock that the dirt originated from. So that bedrock is going to have a specific mineral composition. It's going to have certain chemicals available to it, which is going to impact a whole host of things. I mentioned pH there, but it could be a lot of other aspects. And also erosion patterns, how the bedrock erodes, how quickly, when it does erode, what kind of textures it erode into, so on. So the reason why I went out of order with bedrock is because, to me, it's the most important, because that's the starting building block. So under this parent material, when you take that bedrock and break it down, it's going to get broken down finer and finer particles, and depending on what kind of bedrock it is, it can be broken down into clay, sand, silt, or a combination of the three. So a combination of sand, silt, and clay is going to be loam. So it's somewhere in the middle of this triangle. So clay obviously are extremely fine particles. Obviously, anybody who's done gardens probably cursed at clay. Sand is the largest particle, silt's in between. That texture is going to impact a number of things real quickly. The water holding capacity, so the ability for the soil to hold on to water. So you want the soil to be able to hold on to water, but not too much, because you don't want water just to go in there and just filter right out, but you also don't want the soil to hang on to it and not give it off to the plants. So you want a nice moderate water holding capacity. Same thing with nutrients. You want the soils to hold nutrients, but not too tightly, because if it holds it too tightly, then the plants cannot get the nutrients. Then finally, just pore space, air space, ability for the roots to kind of maneuver around in the soil and grow. So really quickly, those are some of the things that the texture impacts in the soil, and therefore whatever bedrock is there will have certain patterns of being eroded into different sized particles. So in Genesee County, mostly, not everything, but mostly, most of our bedrock is limestone. There is some shale, which this was not planned, however, we had this wonderful piece for show and tell up here. But limestone is our most predominant bedrock in Genesee County. I apologize, you really can't see some of the different formation names here, but you can see the different formations of bedrock across the county are really stratified east to west. So, much of the northern part is the same. You get smaller bands in the middle. That's basically due to the way that the bedrock is oriented in the ground. Uniquely, interestingly, the bedrock in Genesee County really isn't perfectly horizontal relative to the ground surface. It's actually a bit tilted due to plate tectonics. So because they're tilted, you have different ones like this. If they're on a flat plane like that, you're going to see those I'll say the end grains, if you will, of the bedrock. So that's why you see some of the different formations in different parts of the county when you move from the north to the south. So having gone through parent material, onto climate. So climate is actually different than weather. Weather is what's going on right now, which means rain and more rain and more rain. Climate is the long-term average of weather patterns. Usually they say an average over at least 30 years. So it's the long-term average of weather patterns you see. So when you think about climate, some of the things you think about: average temperature, average rainfall patterns, the seasonality of the rainfall. Is it rain or is it snow all the time? And then the freeze-thaw cycles. And when we're thinking about climate and how it impacts soil development, get away from thinking about just Genesee County, but compare Genesee County's climate to the climate in Arizona or the climate in Brazil, whatever. And think about those differences and how that might impact the development of the soil. So if you get a good freeze-thaw cycle, that's going to help break down the bedrock more, because once the water gets in the cracks, freeze-thaw, it's just like our potholes out on the road, it's going to break open the bedrock faster. If you have a good amount of rain, it helps to erode away some of the bedrock into smaller particles. It may take some of the nutrients away from the soil, so that soil that develops there might be nutrient poor, and so on. So that's how climate, when you think about it across the global sense, how that's going to affect the soil that develops in a particular area compared to another. So we did parent material, climate, onto organisms. These are often overlooked in the soil development process, and it's not just worms. Everybody thinks worms, and they're a big one. Ironically, most of the worms that we had in Genesee County probably didn't always exist here. because 10,000 years ago, there was a 1 mile thick sheet of ice on top of us that actually scraped away much of the original soil. So think about a lot of those worms that are here, they weren't here 10,000 years ago. They migrated in or were brought in. So it's not just worms, but actually some of the really cool stuff that we really don't know enough about yet. Bacteria, some we know more about, particularly the bacteria that fix nitrogen, that term fix. So these are nitrogen, or these are bacteria that live on the roots of your legumes, peas and beans, that can take nitrogen gas in the air and turn it into the nitrogen, forms of nitrogen in the soil that plants need. So those, if you have those bacteria, you're going to have more of the bioavailable forms of nitrogen. Then fungi, which can help break down organic matter, and then plants themselves, which put organic matter in the soil. Plants grow, plants pull in carbon dioxide, put on more biomass, they die, they go to the soil, decompose, and they make great topsoil. So, bedrock, climate, organisms, relief. When we say relief, we're talking about the degree with which the land is sloped. So, funny story, the second bullet point, water runs downhill. That should be a very commonly known point. I got that wrong in an exam once, because I was going too fast and didn't read the answers quickly enough. I got it wrong. It was the only question I got wrong in the exam, and my professor did not let me forget about that. But anyway, water runs downhill. But when water runs downhill, it does more than just go downhill. It's carrying soil sediment, it's carrying nutrients, it's carrying organic matter with it going downhill. So for example, if you've got a hill up here, you can see how this is now kind of whited out. That has been eroded away, carried the soil patterns downward, carried the soil material downslope, which was where it's deposited. So probably the soil up here is going to be more of a larger texture, because the smaller texture things, so your silt and clay, which are lighter, probably went downhill. Beyond just erosion and the movement of particles, you can think about how relief impacts where the soil surface is relative to the water table. So if you're downslope, you're really close to the water table, which means, okay, well, not only is it wet, but if it's wet, it's going to impact some of the chemical things going on in the soil, may help with the freeze-thaw cycle, breaking down the bedrock, and so on. So relief can act in a couple different ways. And then time. The cool thing about time is that it interacts with all of the other factors. So the longer you have time, the more erosion you have going downhill the slope. The longer time you have, the more plants you have that are putting organic material into the soil. The longer time you have, you may actually have your nutrients leaving the soil. It's actually the soil is getting really, really old, and all those nutrients are getting leached out. So time interacts with all of those other aspects. A couple of really quick examples here, and this text is not showing up. I'm not expecting you guys to read the text. But this is a picture. There is an entire science on naming soils, right? My wife thinks I'm boring. I don't do that, thankfully. So there's 12 major classes of soils across the globe, broken into finer groups. But one of them is called oxasols. Oxasols are found in South and Central America. They're really old soils. They developed a long time ago, so that time factor is going to play an important role. They've actually been heavily leached. All of that rain in South America, in those oxasol soils, that rain has carried away a lot of the nutrients. So they're actually a really nutrient-poor soil. What's left behind is your oxidized iron, therefore oxasols. And oxidized iron is essentially like rust, gives you the red color. So really old soils, nutrients are leached out. On the other side of the spectrum, alpha sols. This is actually the main group of soils that we see in New York, in our area of New York State at least, not exclusively. But they are soils most commonly found in temperate, humid regions of the world. They're fairly well developed, So they've had a lot of time to maybe build up organic matter, but they're not really, really old like the oxasols, so they still have the nutrients in the soil. So most of what we have in our area, specifically Genesee County, is going to be an oxasol, it's going to be an alkasol, sorry. So I fully admit I borrowed this image from the internet, so credits to whoever had it up there. So this is just a really good kind of pictorial example. We start over here, we have bedrock, so let's say we had a glacier go through here 10,000 years ago, scrape off absolutely everything off the bedrock, we're left with bare rock. Over time, we have rain that is hitting the soil, we get these little cracks, that rain gets in there, freeze-thaw, starts to break things up. You might start getting some of those really early plants starting to grow on the bedrock, which are probably dandelions. They're like my dandelions in my lawn at home, which will start building up that organic matter to build up some nutrients in the soil, build up some organic matter in the soils. And then over time, you start getting darker and darker soils, going down deeper in the soil. You get a buildup of the humus and on top, you start to get more nutrients, and then eventually you start getting really well stratified soil horizons that look like what we think of as soil in our area, where lots of nutrients on top, in the organic layer, and in the A layer, you start getting the B horizon, it's less nutrients, and then down towards the parent material. So that's conceptually how soil forms. Usually when I teach this lecture, I used to, back in the day, teach this kind of lecture at college. Students didn't like soils. They found it really boring, so they were asleep by now, so thank you for staying awake. So, what does all this mean? Okay, I talked to you about kind of this broad overarching model of how soil develops. So our soil here developed from mostly carbonate rocks. There's some shale as well, but mostly carbonate rocks. That is the parent material. We've had a lot of freeze-thaw cycles because it is Genesee County. We freeze in the winter, we warm up in the summertime. That's going to help to break down that rock faster. We have a moderate rainfall pattern, so we're going to have an ample supply of water in the breaking down rocks to help the chemical breakdown, because the water helps to break it chemically. Historically, we've had lots and lots of trees and other soil fauna, which does a lot to help aerate the soil, put organic matter into the soil. So you have lots of nutrients, lots of organic matter, lots of carbon in the soil. Generally speaking, at least in my neck of the woods, we have no hills. But you get some local variation. We have hills in Genesee County. We've got evidence of glaciers, and I'll get into that in a few minutes here. So by and large, yes, there's probably been movement of soil particles down slope, but it's not like we're in the Rocky Mountains where everything just goes straight down. And then roughly, we've had about 10,000 years since that last ice age, which from a historical perspective, that's a moderate length of time for the soils to develop. Enough to make nice soils, but not too long where it's all leached out. So our soils are well developed, but not leached. Our soils are alkaline loam soils. So loam, generally speaking, most commonly is probably a loam in Genesee County, mixture of sand, silt, and clay. You can find examples where this is not the case in Genesee County. This is a very broad paintbrush. Since they're alkaline, having a lot of calcium carbonate in there, the pH is buffered. Does anybody grow blueberries in here? Have blueberry bushes? No? They're a pain in the butt to try to grow. Blueberries like a really low pH, acidic soils. It's very difficult, it takes extra work to create a pH where blueberries and also, azaleas and rhododendrons like to live. Because the calcium carbonate in the soil, the second you put any sort of acid in the soil, it neutralizes it. So our pH is very well buffered, which is actually, so it's a bad thing if you get on blueberries. It's actually a really good thing. So we've heard about acid rain. Acid rain, which affects the Adirondack Mountains a lot. The rain that we get here is roughly just as acidic. It's just our soils are different, so that it neutralizes it. So it's not impacting things as much. And then our soils are fairly high in nutrients. Like I said, we're going to have variation throughout the county, or from yard to yard, field to field, whatever. You can definitely find clay, Some people may know this more than others. Oftentimes you're going to find clay in areas where they might be at the downhill, the toe of a slope, where all the clay particles were deposited from above. You can still find, obviously, sandy outwashes that maybe were laid down by rivers as they move throughout time. And then we have actually got a lot of gravel hills that were deposited from the glaciers. So they're still there from the glaciers. So that's the impact of climate and then also time. So our soils, generally speaking, are very productive. So it provides those nutrients, it holds nutrients, but allows plants to actually take them up because it does not hold them too tightly. Same exact thing for water. We're in that sweet spot for holding nutrients, holding water, but giving it to plants. The pH is buffered. I kind of got through this. That's really good for maples. Maples like high carbonate soil, maple trees, but blueberries, they don't. So in general, really good plant growth in Genesee County. And that's not just farming. That's for natural ecosystems as well. So I kind of threw together, and it looks a little fuzzy from here. This is an example. The first slide. So this is from Elba, because this is the one hill that we have in Elba. We have one. These lines that you're seeing are elevation lines. So for example, if you see like in this area, there's a really long distance between elevation lines, it means it's very flat. Where you start to see elevation lines get closer and closer to each other, that means you've got a steeper and steeper slope, right? So, like I said, this is the one hill we have in Genesee County, or in Elba. This is actually fairly steep for our standards, I'll say. This is a drumlin. It's a glacial feature. So it was laid down, get this right, so as the glacier was receding, there's actually the meltwater flowing underneath the glacier, and they'll form like rivers almost, flowing either in between, on top, or below the glaciers. And as that water is flowing out, it's carrying all sorts of soil material, and it lays them down as that glacier is actually receding backwards. It's laying down this narrow strip of gravel in the landscape. So they're fairly easy to pick up if you know what you're looking for. We actually have, we're part of a good-sized field of drumlins that starts, it's in Genesee County, maybe parts of Livingston, Monroe, as that glacier receded, laying down these gravel soils. So what's interesting, so you see how, okay, this is a hill, a really long, narrow hill going from the southwest to the northeast. That's the slope, and if it hopefully shows up well, these different colors are actually different mapped soils, the soil series. And you'll see they're actually completely oriented. I'll kind of toggle back and forth because it's not showing up as well as I wanted. You can see where the hill is, and see how those soils follow that long axis of the hill. So up on the very top, you're going to have one soil series that's going to be pretty flat. It's on top of the hill, probably heavy on sand particles, maybe a lot of pebbles and cobbles as well. As you start going down the side of the slope, you're going to see steeper sides, and you might start seeing more and more of the silted clay. And then once you get down into the very bottom, that's where all the material is deposited after erosion is done. So you can see down below is where you're going to get your really heavy soils that are difficult to work in plowing and so on, because there's probably more clay down there. So I like the glacial history of Western New York. It's really interesting what it's done, but that's what I think about. So all of this stuff, I mentioned that CORT, Climate Organisms Relief Permanent Material Time. I mentioned that's a soils thing. Ecology guys like me have actually borrowed it to help explain why different ecosystems are where they are. And you always see certain ecosystems growing in certain combinations of CORT. So for example, we are in the Great Lakes Plains here. So this is the Erie, Ontario lowlands. It actually goes all throughout northern Western New York and northern Central New York. If you think about it, all the soils through there, generally speaking, are very similar. And also, natively speaking, the plant communities were very similar. A lot of maple, oak, beech maple forests, that kind of stuff. And then also, from a farming perspective, you think about the farms that grow through here, that are through here, really heavy on dairy farms, and also, well, if you get close, you get the orchards close to Lake Ontario, but the soils and slopes and hills that do well for growing corn and corn and hay are good for having those dairy farms. So I just went through all this already, I realized that, sorry. So the Erie, Ontario Plains. Very rich natural communities, naturally speaking. The Northern Hardwood Forest, those forests, which existed for a few thousand years before we showed up, put a lot of organic material into the soils, made that real dark, rich soil. Recently speaking, we're talking 200 to 300 years, or even 100 years, which is a blink of the eye, those forests were cleared. So, you know, Western Europe, by and large, Genesee County, by and large, was completely forested. So, after being cleared, the farms popped up. Generally speaking, nowadays, most of what we farm, what our soils are really good for, are some of your annual crops. Corn, soybeans, you're planting annually. They tolerate our moderate length season, our moderate temperature and rainfall patterns. So corn, soybeans, we also see a good amount of veg crops, cabbage, onions. My hometown known for onions. I didn't grow them personally. And then hay, which historically speaking, really heavy on the grass. Within the past 30, 40, 50 years, mostly alfalfa mixes. So the historical processes that made our soils made it really good for farming. We did a lot of things that actually impacted soils quite a bit. So with that land clearing, we've actually altered rainfall patterns, we've altered drainage patterns. Both of those have contributed to erosion problems. Genesee County, the flat portions, we don't see as much erosion because it doesn't flow because of no slope. But if you get just enough of a slope, water runs downhill, obviously. And those are some of your traditional farming practices that maybe contributed to that, leaving bare soil in the wintertime. So, you know, those soils that were really, really good and still are really good have actually been impacted quite a bit based with those traditional farming practices. So loss of topsoil, nutrients, and organic matter.
Excuse me, you said altered rain.
Yeah.
How could man alter the rainfall?
That would go back to climate change. So for instance, you know, we're seeing rainstorms that are, you know, at a magnitude much larger than we're used to seeing, and also happening more often. So, Attica got hit with a 5-inch rainfall 3 years ago. It's 5 inches. So now kind of getting to the new horizon. The current buzzword in the soil and water field, and also my federal counterparts with NRCS, is soil health. So practices that improve soil, and by and large, it's a combination of a number of things. They can be grouped into, you know, having as little disturbance in the soil as possible, maximizing the amount of plant cover on the soil at all times throughout the year, maximizing biodiversity, so not having one single plant species, but actually having a lot of different plant species growing at the same time, which many of these lead into providing continuous live roots, continuous growth of live roots in the soil. So those are generally what those practices include doing. The best example of what, we've got a number of projects right now at Soil and Water. Lots and lots of cover crops, so cover cropping. The benefits there, we have reduced erosion because we constantly have plant matter on top of the soils, which is holding the soil together, not letting water flow too fastly. And if you're making water slow down, water infiltrates into the soil. If you get water infiltrating the soil, you recharge the groundwater, which is going to help those crops 2 months from now when you start getting into July and August. So instead of water going straight downhill into the creek and gone, it's staying into the field. It increases the nutrients, especially increasing the organic matter in the soil. So all of those cover crops, which get planted in the fall time, all that dead plant matter goes right back into the soil and puts organic matter back in the soil. Depending on the species used for the cover crop, they may have really, really deep roots on the order of 2.5 feet. That helps to get down and actually break up the soil, which may have been compacted over many years of large equipment compacting it. And then also, ironically, people think of, they drive by and they see a field with a bunch of cover crops, they see, well, that field's just a whole bunch of weeds, that farmer's lazy. Actually, it's helping to suppress the bad weeds that you don't want. So you're letting good cover crops be there, suppressing the bad weeds you may not want. It looks messy, but it's better from a soil health perspective. So that's the benefits to the soil that help the farm, but from an ecosystem perspective, we're helping to keep the water clean, so water that does run off the field, not as much soil or nitrogen and phosphorus. You're limiting runoff and also helping to maybe mitigate or lessen the impacts of climate change. The carbon dioxide that's in the air is being photosynthesized by the plants, and then that carbon is going into the soil, not back into the air. So you're going to actually, hopefully, try to reverse that trend. So this is an example of a field of cover crops. It looks weedy, right? If you drive by, they should think, you know, that farmer's just lazy, not taking care of his weeds. This is a really good mixture. You can see you can easily see there's actually 2 different species in here. It's a really good dense cover holding that soil together. Zoomed in a little bit, you know, you can see, I forget, I'm not from the agronomy side, so this is a little bit new to me. So my coworker Tim could speak better to this, but I think these are, radishes, or turnips, the 2. So with that, that's kind of an overview of the soils we have here, why did they get here, things we've done to impact them, and things we're doing to make them better and make the world better and keep the water clean. So, there's that.
Let's have some questions.
What about the average person? What can we do?
Average person? With respect to what?
Helping to maintain the land and stuff?
Maintain the land.
I recycle, reuse, reduce.
Yep. Perfect, and perfect.
But is there anything more I can? I put coffee grounds on my flower bed. So
That's good. Choosing, this is outside soils, but I love the question, so I'll go there. Making your spending patterns to get, if we're speaking about farming and food, trying to source your food from as close as possible.
Local fresh.
Local, yeah, which is, it's difficult to do. You can't get fresh lettuce in January, so you can't do that, obviously. But, you know, do what you can, because then you're buying it locally, it's not being shipped, which, if you think about that, the amount of energy that's spent shipping it over and that kind of thing. If you happen to have a local, there's a movement recently of small and medium-sized farms popping up who are doing their best to take more, I'll say, better approaches to maintaining the land. If they're at a farmer's market, go give money to them.
Yeah.
So,
Watch out for how things are packaged and stuff.
packaging, yeah. So,
Okay.
it's a really good question.
No, I was just kind of wondering, getting back to how you're talking about how soil actually forms from the basic bedrock.
Yeah.
I guess I was wondering if you could go in a little more detail on how you go from the actual rock.
Yeah.
To how it
Yeah. So I guess I kind of skimmed over that.
soil.
So you say you've got a rock like this, which,
No.
if I may, I'll take this rock. You may not see it, but there's some small cracks in here. So first things first, in Genesee County with the freeze-thaw cycle, water's going to get inside, start breaking this into smaller and smaller, still rock, but smaller particles. But then over time, as rainwater falls on it, it'll physically be broken just by water running against it, and that'll break it off into sand or silt or clay particles. It may have, with the water landing on it, much like water on your car, chemical reactions, your car rusts, well, that chemical reaction might help to dissolve part of the rock into smaller and smaller pieces. So usually it's a combination of 2 things. physical and chemical weathering. So physical, breaking it apart, chemical, dissolving it, chemical reactions kind of thing.
But, I mean, is it like the actual interaction with organisms that
Well,
actually turns it?
organisms can also speed it up. I used to do a fair amount of hiking in Adirondacks, so you can see like this rock face, and you'll have this tree growing out of a crack in a rock, right? And as those roots expand, it's going to break it apart. Yeah. So organisms can definitely help.
How long would it take for that to happen before you have enough soil there that you can grow stuff? I mean, you're talking about an extremely long time.
We're talking geologic timescales. That's correct.
Okay.
I'm going to think back, and I'm going to throw a statistic out there. I'd have to look it up later on because I might be wrong. But it's something on the order of like an eighth of an inch in 1,000 years, or an eighth of an inch in 100 years, or 500 years. We're talking 500? Yeah, thank you. You should give a presentation. There's a camcorder and everything. It's great.
A good example, water erosion is Niagara Falls.
Exactly. And also, it's eroding different parts of Niagara Falls at different rates. Because there's actually different layers of bedrock in Niagara Falls. And you've got the part that the water's running on is actually harder. And let me get this right, you can correct me if you like. The bottom, underneath it, it's actually softer types of bedrock. So the water's running across here, not doing as much on the bedrock it's hitting heads, but as it comes down, it's undercutting and taking out that softer stuff below. And as it does that, you'll start having this cliff, and then it breaks off that. Yeah, that was a good one. Yeah, water eroding the Niagara River, or the Niagara Gorge.
Or the Genesee.
Genesee. Yep, yep.
Rocks always seem to be working their way up.
Yep.
And I always figured it had to deal with the frost, but then you get thinking the frost only goes down so far. You should get ahead of it at some point.
Yeah, that's the first law of farming, right?
Yeah.
Rocks always show up. It is, as I understand it, and my father probably yelled at me because I might get it wrong here. It is a combination of the frost, freeze, thaw, as well as we don't have the tree cover anymore, which is a continuous, really good root system. Think of a forest and the roots that hold it. It'll actually help keep some of the rocks down, I think. But it's definitely the freeze thaw is going to push the rocks up.
But it should only be the depth of the frost, right?
You'd think.
And it
They
seems
keep
like it's
coming.
coming, they just keep
There's a lot of
coming.
rocks down there. So, yeah, I mean, you think about how many rocks are there and how long it takes to actually come up. It's going to probably take a few thousand years for us to go through all of them. Yeah.
Another part of that, just adding to that, is a lot of the rocks that are here in the soil is because of the ground moraine, which is when the glacier was retreating, it has different spots that are rests and different spots that it moves continuously. Wherever it rests, it forms this thing called a terminal moraine, where there's like a lump of soil. And then for when it glides evenly, it's ground moraine. And when it deposits all that material, it's depositing it in a lot of sorts of place where everything is discombobulated. There's sand, silt, clay, giant boulders. Everything is kind of in there. And that's why when you're farming, there's rocks everywhere. And then they just keep coming back because of uplift, where uplift happens because of plate tectonics and science and stuff. Everything is constantly moving up. So no matter how many rocks you get out, there's always going to be more coming up on
I
it.
agree.
Does it every year.
She's a real geologist, and I'm not.
I thought they
I play one on TV.
But also erosion, land erosion,
used to say.
the more erosion, the more rocks show up because there's
Yeah.
nowhere to build them.
Yeah,
But when the thing with the trees though, I mean, we love to go down to Allegheny State Park,
gorgeous place.
and you got these monstrous trees growing in these little cracks, and the roots are like 10 feet long to the
Yeah.
floor. It's like, and sometimes the rock is worn away, and just the tree roots are there. It's fast. It blows your mind.
And I can't grow a rose in my house, but those trees will grow in that crack
Yeah.
of rock. Yeah. So.
And their stones are gone, but the tree is still there. It's like,
So this So there's the A horizon, B horizon, and C horizon, and then bedrock. So your C horizon is where a lot of your real large, they're free rocks, but they're still very large boulders. That's where your rocks are mostly coming from. It's going to take a few thousand years of frost, freeze and thaw to get rid of them, and you pick them out constantly. So give it a couple thousand years, it'll be easier.
So global warming would be good.
If you want to look at it that way, if you don't like picking rocks, that's the one thing you know, yeah, there's other issues there. So.
Okay, another question, as far as my garden, I get cow manure from my neighbor, and I compost it, I rotate it,
Yep.
I add it to the garden. Is there a point of too much organic matter?
Depends on what you're trying to grow. Yes, probably. At some point, you probably want some mineral in there. But there are some plants that will only grow on pure organic. Generally speaking, I'm not a gardener, and as much as I grew up on a dairy farm, agronomy is it's not my specialty. You're probably not going to be too worried about it. Keep putting manure in, you're good to go. Just compost at the right temperature, kill the bacteria, and kill the seeds in there. It'll be fine. Talk to Cornell Crop Extension, they might help you out too.
Does the Alba Mudland show up on that one map?
Nope. Yeah, no, this is actually probably about a mile south of the muck. There's no hills in the muck. So that
Now, where
map,
is that?
Yeah, that's what
You
I,
know,
this one,
what roads are near that?
think, if I remember correctly, this is, so Bridge Road, Lock City Road, and Norton Road.
Okay.
Let's see.
Yeah, you get kind of in the the northeast section of Elba, northern Byron, northern Virgin. That's where you see more of those trunks. Yeah, you're just going along, all of a sudden, random hill, I don't know
Yes,
where.
looks like the end of the earth.
Yeah,
You go up
yeah,
there.
yeah. So, it's kind of cool. I mean, so this elevation data was created by LiDAR, so satellite shooting radar down. I was gonna say laser beam, but it's not laser. And then bouncing back and then measuring the time it takes to return. What's crazy with this LiDAR, so that's how you're getting all these elevations. So there's actually 2 feet of elevation difference between these two lines. You can actually see where the roads are. That's a road, that's a road, because the road might be built up a little. You can actually see that in LiDAR.
Cool.
Yeah, yeah. LiDAR's really cool.
That's cool.
Yeah.
Now go to another county.
Pardon me?
I said, let's just step to another county. Molasses still over in,
Wyoming?
it's Wyoming, Genesee, but it's
Yeah.
molasses still. Now, what is that huge, would that been deposit of glacier?
So down there, you start getting south of Route 20, you're starting to see a different bedrock down there.
Yeah.
I think that's probably the signature you're seeing. I don't think that's a glacial feature. That's just, it's a different type of bedrock,
Okay.
I
Because
guess.
that's when we really started in rural hills. So I'm not-
Well, yeah, you get south of 20, it's an entirely different world.
It is a different world, yeah.
Yeah.
I grew up in that world.
Yeah, different landscape, different climate. The snow they get down there, the rainfall they get
Yeah.
down there is different than you get.
Another world.
It's a different lecture on weather.
So last, 2 or 3 days ago, we were in our garden or we were in our lawn, and there were these little mushrooms coming up.
Yep.
And it turned out that they were morels.
I've never actually found one. I know people that go out and look for them.
They were, I know, so
Did you know?
they were in a line, like from the door straight over here toward the bird feeder. And I thought, well, maybe an animal brought the, is it mycelium? Whatever the mushroom
Yeah.
spores are. And so anyway, last night we went on the internet and tried to find out more about morels. So we found out more about morels, and it said that their ecosystem was near tulip poplars, elms, and slippery elms. Well, we have a tulip poplar, but it's 150 feet away. So then it's also near May apples. So we went down in the back lot this afternoon and looked at the May apples because they found a lot of these, we found nothing at all. And, so I was interested in how you might think that would have gotten here. An animal.
Sure, yeah, I know I've seen one that was a perfect circle.
I've seen them very simple.
Yeah, where basically there was one individual mushroom last year, it let off all the spores, and they just kind of went in a circle. I was looking like, is it like mushroom circles from like aliens, like what is it? I don't know.
No, very simple.
Okay, I like my theory on alien
Go
circles
to the
though.
world of fairies.
Going back to
Yeah.
the late 30s,
Yep.
where my dad had permanent pasture, then you go out there a certain time of year with a 8-quart basket, and you just fill it up. We
With-
don't have permanent pastures anymore, so we don't.
See, a number of guys actually going back to permanent pasture, at least, you know, during the growing season, which is, it's a good thing, and that's really good for the soil.
What is it, permanent?
Pasture, so, you know, having the cows on pasture, bring them in the milk, but send them back out.
Oh, yeah,
So-
that's my grandfather was.
Yeah, no, that's a really good thing.
It's good all the way around for the animals to be outside.
Yeah, and
You don't have to shovel as much manure either.
that's number one for me, I grew up on a farm as a kid.
I grew up with
Yeah, and, you know, there's also the aspects of, you don't have to plant, harvest, haul, and store as much corn or alfalfa if they're out on pasture as much, and it's good for the soil. 100%.
And one other question, when I was growing up, our soil on our farm was very dark loam, beautiful, dark loam. And when I came back here, which was like 15 years ago, and started noticing, I thought that the soil was quite pink.
Okay.
And I was just thinking about over a 50-year period, how much loss of nutrient
Yeah.
actually caused, or what microorganisms are not there anymore that would actually allow a
That-
pink. I
That
don't know if that's a
darkness,
mineral.
yeah, that darkness that was lost, that was organic matter. So back home, I live on the old farmstead, if you will. We've got a section of woods out back that was never caught, you know.
Beautiful
Yeah,
dark loam.
I dug up some, you know, some saplings here and there and moved around. I mean, it's just jet black soil, and I go 100 feet in the field, and it's running great. And that is loss of organic matter, that's carbon. So that's, you know, that's one of the big things, as I went to this slide here, you know, the cover crops, you know, put a lot of the organic matter back in, take the carbon from the atmosphere and put it in soils. And then, once it's in the soil, where is it? Trying to minimize disturbance as much as possible. When you disturb it, that organic matter gets exposed to air, it can hardly decompose, and carbon dioxide in the atmosphere.
What do you just call it underdone?
A lot of these guys will do no-till, limited till as much as possible, so that, you know, and you're seeing more and more people, but it's still relatively new in the area. It takes some specialized equipment to be able to do, but
The time invested and, you know, money and, but still, it's the only way we're gonna save the land.
so, yep, keeps the dirt in the soil, keeps it out of water.
What would be the trajectory if you were not really adding cover crops all the time of the loss? I mean, if it's over a 50-year period that I would have noticed this change on a really,
Yeah.
some of the land is very, very good. So it's scary to think that we are using up the soil.
Yeah, you think about it, let's say you lose 1/10 of an inch of soil per year, which is pretty minuscule, right? Less than an eighth of an inch. Over 10 years, if that plot is losing 1/10 of an inch per year, you're losing an inch of soil.
But in addition, it's losing microorganisms and its quality.
Quality, quantity, yep. Yeah, so, and not everybody's losing soil at that rate. You know, it depends where you are in the landscape and what kind of management patterns you have, and that's probably on the high side, most likely. So,
But then we build on it and we cover a lot of our good farmland with asphalt and other
Yeah.
things that it's not good for the humans.
watching some programs on PBS about cities that are sinking. Because flooding in the coast sinking, New York, Miami, Tokyo, so forth. And they're finding it's because there is no land. It's all concrete.
paved over.
Well, it's
And the
county.
water can't go anywhere, and then you have heavy runoff, and you lose whatever you have.
So as far as land subsidence, and this is the only place I'm familiar with for actually subsiding, you get down the Delta of Louisiana.
Yeah.
But a lot of those other ones, it's an issue due to, a lot of rising sea level as well.
Well, because of the rain and the water that comes down through, like,
Rising sea levels.
and stuff like that, and they have no place for the water to go except out and take everything out with it, and they have no way of controlling it. But I mean, that's just gonna enlarge what we are creating, that's destroying the earth, because we're putting in concrete, asphalt, the water can't go anywhere.
Well, it does, it just goes someplace faster.
It goes somewhere, but it should go down.
Yeah, it's not just concrete and asphalt, it's also,
held and,
bare soil.
cleaned and, but it's taken off and call it,
so.
just.
Yeah, we've done a really good job of making water move really fast. Sometimes to the detection of things. So,
Now, does soil and water they go to farmers, they help farmers only?
yeah,
They help
no,
other
it's
people?
not farms only. It's actually, it's unique. I mean, soil and water, it's an interesting, we're a government agency. It's
Mhm.
difficult to describe. Technically, our title is, we are quasi-county. The closest thing we report back to is the county level. That said, actually, we get a lot of state funding for our activities. Soil and water is really different from county to county, which is good and unique because they can kind of tailor their activities to what they do. So, I mean, Genesee County historically was an ag-centric soil and water conservation district. So, focused heavily on agriculture. That's not the only thing we do, though. And there's been some diversification recently. For the most part, it's working with private landowners. Most commonly, Genesee County private landowners are farms, but it's working with private landowners.
What's an example of someone that's not a farmer?
Let's see here.
Who would you-
There's somebody who's got, I can't, I'm not gonna say names,
No.
but if an individual, actually there's a municipality we're working with, had some discussions with, there is a severe erosion problem on a stream that goes along part of the municipal owned land, and trying to come up with an idea on stop the erosion on the land. Another one, not-for-profit organization that owns land, pristine land, working it on and controlling some invasive species that are invasive plant species that come in, they're not native to the area, and are proliferating and trying to basically kill them so that the native plants can survive.
And,
That's working with a nonprofit, so nonprofit, municipality, private landowners. So
You want to say something about invasive species before you leave?
I could go
We were
on for
talking
hours.
about-
That's actually more invasive
Talking about
species.
knotweed?
Yeah, knotweed is showing up, it's rearing its ugly head, it's not as bad here as it is in other places.
It's pretty bad.
Yeah, so what happens, by and large, invasive species comes in and is able to overtake a certain ecosystem and displace other plants, displace other animals, and impact it. So whether it's Japanese knotweed, oftentimes on stream banks, but not always. Phragmites, you'll see that growing in ditches all over the place. That's the grass that's like 10 feet tall with a big old plume on top. There's almost nothing else growing in there. So what's the problem with that? Well, if it's a single plant species, a lot of wildlife species can't use it as habitat. So if it's only one plant, very few species can use it.
So how do you eradicate that?
Yeah.
Phragmites,
Is that
if you come up with a good answer, that's a good, easy
Bulldozer.
answer, you'll be rich. Historically, I mean, combination of techniques, anything from smothering black plastic, chemicals, chemical treatments, herbicides, a couple different ones you can use. People have tried burning, it's not all that effective. That's an uphill battle for anybody's.
What is on farms around Genesee County that is not weed, it's.
They use with farms, because generally speaking, the ground gets disturbed so often, invasive plants really don't take over. It's more just weeds that they don't want to see, but not necessarily invasives. Weeds are more of an agricultural term, invasive is an ecology term. But we're starting to see, my mind is blank out.
Family,
Pardon?
what family is it in?
Parsnip.
Oh,
white
yes,
flower.
Yes, we know it.
Can't remember, I'm blanking on it. Yeah, pardon?
Hogweed.
Hogweed, giant hogweed. Caraculium menzentis, something or other. Yeah, that's what we're seeing more.
And how are you taking care of that?
I don't touch it.
Because you can't touch it.
You can't touch
What
it because
can
it's
you do?
basically whatever first degree burns on your skin for 6 months. You call your friendly DEC office, let them know as soon as possible, and they have a crew that comes around with full, basically tie-back hazmat suits and removes it for you. If they can get to it, because there's like 4 people, and then they cover 8 counties.
What's that, which one?
So Queen Anne's lace,
Yes.
Oh, okay.
right? So Queen Anne's lace, which is
Beautiful
about
plant.
Yeah, I
A
know.
tall and a flower head like that. Imagine Queen Anne's lace about 10 to 15
Okay,
feet
I've seen
tall,
that.
with a flower head 3 feet in diameter and leaves as big as elephant ears.
Call the DC immediately.
It's very distinctive when you see it.
Call the DC immediately.
Yes.
That's all.
Don't touch it.
Do you work with the birds and swamp?
I have collaborated bird and swamp with Hess. Yes.
They have invasive grass growing in there that they.
I was just on a phone call in the parking lot about that grass before it
What
came.
was the
Yeah.
name of that grass?
So that was not mine. See, I'm getting late
You
in
know
the
what
day,
it
my
was?
brain's shutting down.
Do you know what the name is?
There's actually a few invasive grasses in there. Brachypodium is the genus. It's always called, referred to as Brachypodium. I don't know the common name. But it's an invasive grass that is displacing smaller, nice, short-statured plants in the swamp.
And it's come from out west, they figured.
It was first, is also invasive out there, predominantly in Oregon area, is where they documented it first. That's not where it's from originally, though. A good friend of mine, collaborator, is working on a project trying to kill as much of it as possible, and actually Soil and Water helped out a bit last year with weed whackers
Just leave
See, I
it.
live right
and
there.
compost.
You're talking about Mike?
Not Mike, it's somebody else, but yeah. So,
They sprayed once or.
yeah, and that's invasive, it's unfortunate.
The trouble with spraying these things is that there are beautiful wildflowers and beautiful, that are not weeds. Jack Republic would be taken out by,
Where it was
Spraying.
being sprayed, it was only in areas where it was 100% brachypodium. There was nothing else
terrible.
growing there. So that was definitely taken into account.
It's actually on the higher, drier ground.
If I recall, yeah. They've also got fragmites in the swamp too.
I guess one reason there's some of us here tonight is,
It may be an issue I'm not gonna comment on.
pardon?
So what are you here for?
The solar,
Mhm.
putting it in the town plan.
Mhm.
Now, did you work on any end of that?
Nope.
thing?
That is an issue that's outside my jurisdiction. That is something that I've not worked with. And as a technical agency, not a regulatory agency, I would like to avoid approaching that hot button topic.
Good move.
well, that was a conversation Stafford made.
I apologize.
It's not there. Taking good farmland, if it happens, this is what I hear. It's just hearsay, but tough.
Soil water has not been involved in that whatsoever, and it's outside our jurisdiction.
Somebody from New York City.
I'm just
It's
saying.
all about money.
So, anything more on soils? What did you say?
I agree with John. You've heard me say that how many times? It's all about money.
Okay, what else?